Adaptation restriction of time frame is process lines that go through the higher time to sim. Now we have to understand how to go through modulations, lines adapter, process lines of indication setting, lines of flux. Your central system is understanding how to go through frames of highways and travel. Now we have DQ. Okay, this is Thursday lines of setting, operation lines of travel, communication convergence system, and travel calculations and direction. So we're going to go through the simulation grounds. We're starting the sequence and higher self lines of panel. I'll show you how to get in your ground operators and how to use the higher self lines, because you have to understand how to use that information setting when you actually see yourself as the higher self, as its projection to its avatar, to its sim. You have to understand how to go through 3 programs on one cycle, 16,000 cycles in one position. How I set these things is all lines of all different lines of communication, all on one self-attraction. Okay, so data operating line ground centers and net core centers. There's 7 lines of settings to your systems and data operating system. Start with the ground lines of sequence. Let's convert the system lines of calculation. Now it's going to get very complicated. How we try with that setting. Okay, ground operation lines at one signal, travels all together. All right. 4 center grounds, 4 set centers, and 4 sequence lines of ground communication. Works in 3 centers of angles. Travels point lines of graph, clocking centers of 0, operation lines of travel. Convert the system to calculations. High operation lines, 144 flux, travel communication. Look at that, disappeared. See? It's going too fast in travel communications. Let's do it again. There it is. All right. So we modify the location grid, and this is ground line signals, higher self lines of travel, higher self lines of grounds, higher line settings in positions, higher lines of position, all levels of equals lines of A over B, B over C, D flux over J, which is jump scar, into question over screen. Okay, now this is identified through the higher self lines of travel, just the higher self through formula equation. So you guys have to understand this because you're going to be in no memory. Your networks, the operation of your mind, okay, is going to be the existing, okay, of its mind alterations, of its operating as readjusting you. No memory, process communication. All right. So you have to understand how to use that information lines, graph screens, center points, point graphs, of course, centers of central graph communication, all through box frame. Travels all together, works in frame. Directing ground centers, lines of triangulation line core centers, then we convert the system in settings. Higher self is lines of 12 lines of cycles that communicates to all up to 6 habitation and 6 inhabitation zones. Lives in the outside line, but it also lives on the outside square in communication. Okay, inside line, outside line, right? So it's converting static line communication nebula, inside lines of travel, and outside nebula with its another line position. So that's 12 signals as center of operation and 12 signals outside line position location measured. So you got the inner space and we got the outer lines of spectrum. Okay, so time sequence, flux over 3 centers of square. It's going to get very, very complicated. And this is just to the higher self, the structure of formula equation. All right, so we go through high core centers calculation screens, adaptation of flux into thermal, directing ground centers of transparent, thermal line, indirect lines of grounds, setting sequence, watts over screen. So let's start off in a watt line rotations and 4 square roots, electrical lines of 3 convergence lines of wires at 4 set lines of travel, directing ground centers lines of sequence, plateau locations, high core center communication, signal lines of modification. All right. Plasma lines directing on center on sequence through intelligence information lines of grounds and set travel. Operation lines of sequence, process lines of indication setting. So we change the flux lines. Okay, change the thermal lines settings, screen adaptations and translucent, transparent, and X-ray information lines of grounds. Operation lines of sequence. Plateau line core centers correlates the communication convergence setting in 45 angles in travel. Now we cross those angles and 4 screen locations in adaptation. process line, crossing line angles, at square roots, it's panels of operation screen. Very powerful stuff, how it really gets more the proficient in the position lines of calculation efficacy and its performance comes more lines of high set lines of travel in a graph calculation screen locations in its system. So the higher self can indicate anything through transparent, translucent thermal X-ray because it has 12 settings of signals. That's a lot of light signal lines of travel through dimensional lines of a being of a light that has the process of indication that controls everything of ground operation from 0 to 12 and 13 line of measure, all through set position operation to higher self. Okay, now as we go higher, the structure changes. Okay, the square root, the triangulation flux. So now we are coming out of the higher self of grounds of the Schumann resonance. Now we're coming into the avatar, into portals in stargates. Now we start with the grounds. We stay with the operation line signals. Platforms over lines, EQ, set course centers, line directs 40, so high line rotations, and traffic communication of convergence. And set lines of travel. Works all together in set calculations. Working with that is the Grothians. Now the Grothians, they go between 30,000, 50,000, 150,000 feet below the Earth of the core, the center core, the galactic energy core, the process communication core, the operation lines of settings, the data operation setting. All right, setting sequence panels, pyramid activation lines in console, into navigation grounds, pixelation graphs, 42 location and streamlines of indication, right there in traction, right? So we go through a plasma wall line that rotates the cycles lines of perimeters over lines that course centers of convergence and directing ground centers in settings. So the higher self sets up the firewalls, okay, in plasma lines, pillars of light, and 3 centers of central communication. Okay, so nothing penetrates the wall. Okay, this is all through ground operation, just through the higher self, through its firewall. Okay, now getting into the firewall, crosses angles and 4 centers of flush over screen, 3 centers of measure, 5 lines of scale of communication. Directing ground centers line conditions is a wall convergence of travels of direct centers in Skynet and location. All right, so it's going to get really confusing for you guys. And this is all done to the higher self itself. All right, so gravity locks, shift lines anomaly to the gravitational pull that processes communicates to its thermometer, directing lines to its barometer, locates to its temperature readings, directing ground centers. And this is where it gets interesting because we sent at the core system lines to calculate setting. Now, the connection to the higher self has a measure scale to a thermometer lines of a temperature reading. The process indicates setting, how fast it goes, and acceleration system and galaxy of alignment that coordinates the travels in position to oscillator that change the wind factors, location setting to you in position how to use your geotherems in your geostorms. That's right, all through the higher self. Same with the avatar and same with the synth. They all that. They have to have 6 habitation and 6 inhabitation zones. 6 earth line rotation and 6 outline rotations of Earth. So they can understand how to monitor their system and setting. They have their own probing. They have their own orbs of indications. Now working with that cycles is knowing how to center off the system lines of triangulation lines of flux. The process indicates how to use that through box frame, location setting to its convergence over channel through operation. Okay. All right, so as we go in that position, we come into pyramid lines. There's the pyramid right there above the signal where the higher self goes into its own system of its own travels of directions and location. Okay, process in that position. And then we go in positions in property of design and set lines of travel. Okay, it gets really interesting how we go through this line. So we split 2, 3 lines of anomaly, 4 centers of sequence, 5, 6, 8 lines of square root over triangulation. There's the building. Okay. The building itself is the body itself that modifies everything locates to its setting. So it sets lines position of 4 angles over 6 over lines over flush. Now that process lines of 2 over 3, the process lines of indicates lines of travel. Now in that indicated system, it knows what it's doing through its own property of its own design, creating the infrastructure, how the body constantly changes itself into its modification of self-modulation in a space modulation system to center off its system all through a clocking foundation. all through setting, all through operation. Okay? There it is. Properties of design, right? So it's really interesting when you come into the formation lines and they're studying that from any high centers, you can process that position to higher lines of travel. Adding square roots over lines of panel, process lines of indication lines of correlations, calculation setting. Sets position to operation set travel. Now, once it ends its extended ground lines, it changes time frame and clocking screen locations. Okay, center operation lines of 2 panels, 2 slide windows, process lines of indication lines of flux. And goes point lines of graph, directing ground centers, shape lines of anomaly. In that position locations, the ground shifts lines as rotations, and panels and screens of clocking center location. Process lines of the grounds, process lines of centers, and process lines into its galaxy alignment location of the system. Grounds powers atmospheres. Okay? Change time frame again, locks the signals to a compass or rotation lines of spin cycles and travel. Setting operation lines of high center locations, we set the convergence system with flywheel that realigns its communication setting to its processing. Directing to ground centers, set position its operation. It's tetrahedron. That's right. So the tetrahedron is processing all line course centers to a part of accelerator, sets course centers communication setting clock lines of its parallels, the paraline polar shift. Directing ground centers line communication setting converts the system into a central wheel and 4 centers of angles or 4 clocking system lines of travel. There it is, done by equation. And that's what a higher self does every second, every minute of its hour, of its day through flux. It constantly changes the shapes of its anomaly and processes the indication system all through settings, all through operation. Okay? So it's pretty incredible as you constantly change the formation system of time centers as sequence, the platitudes as location of travel. But you can see the Merkaba tetrahedron in set lines of the diamond core in set travel. So that's your test, right? For next Friday, just the higher self itself. So I'm going 7 days ahead, okay, in set lines of travel. Identifying that location setting to all lines of high position of its operation sequence. But that's how you modify to the higher self in communication. It's all geometrics, it's all sacred geometry, it's knowing how to use the geological, geographical system in your settings, your geotherms and your geostorms that indicates everything you're doing through an oscillation to an oscillator and rotates lines of grounds and set lines of travel, all in set position, it's operation. Okay? Hooah. All right? All right. As you go in the higher self, we communicate to ground centers. We're still with the higher self. We're not going with the avatar because you have a test on the higher self, which is next Friday. All right. So once we get the ground line centers, the Merkaba tetrahedron, the higher self comes in a new coolant channel. The operation line core centers convergence system sets up proxy convergence lines of setting. This comes into opposition to its power and its energy grid. That's right. Higher self has a power and it has its own energy grid. Now, this is where we come into the central ways of communication of electronics. Directing ground centers puts convergent system all through calculus lines of travel. Electrical line settings, electrical lines magnetics, magnetic lines of force, high position static interference, sonic interference, magnetic line centers of travel, and direct lines of discharge. Electrical lines of discharge, electrical lines of magnetic force lines of discharge, discharge over lines of pi, over lines of signal, over lines of position, over lines of calculations, all through higher self over lines of pi. Sets position lines of travel of communications to its indication setting, all through flux, all through flush. So we set an 8-track provision. Now this is the battery read line centers of core. Core centers that calculate lines of positive or negative. Now we process that through indication setting that processes lines of its truth to its false narrative and line position of space and time. Set core centers, 8-track, set lines into equals higher self. Process lines into temperature reading. Now the core centers of the convergence system is 98,000 lines, square root. That's right, guys. 98,000 square root through 3 signatures of ground lines of symbolism, location of travel. Now that indicates core centers of communication lines 144 flux and set lines of communication. Directing ground centers line sequence, processing the set position as dimensional solar sail, take the indication system to the atmosphere lines, the process locations of where it's going through its indication of its atmospheres, hemispheres, or stratospheres at set design. Processes that position, change course centers and position to its Orion's belt. That's right, Orion's belt. Finger point graphs, interset locations, interception, interconnection, interlink, interwebbing, and rotates lines of grounds in sequence, location of flux. Process setting, lines of travel, directing lines of webbing over screen. 4 indicates lines of setting, 5 lines of signals. Sets core centers, convergence system, in set operation. Clocking centers in position of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and set lines of scale. Your teleportation vessel. Ground center sequence, crop circles over square roots, triangulate core centers, and codification setting and grounds. This is all through the higher self. So higher self is the gravitational pull that processes everything, location, sets all those position of its convergence of channels. The operation lines of sequence puts all communication setting to its processing, to its subtronic location. Now subunits sets all communication lines of grounds and high lines of sequence. The platitude location is a planetary line, simulation grounds and core centers of convergence system, all through electrical wires and set lines of travel. On center, on sequence, on communications, on travel communication, with scouts alignment, in an oscillator of a wind path in rotation. All done through the higher self. Okay? All through magnetic, all through force, right? So you have to see it in all different angles of flux over screen and box frame over triangulation. It's time reactor. That's right, guys. Cubical screen lines is a box frame. Triangulation lines of circulation ground centers, process location system, and set calculations. Now the time reactor has a reactor line pull that processes its position location to its compulsory that sets the ventricle system and calculate modify, directing ground centers lines of sequence, sets portal sequence, and set position lines of calculation setting. Now the higher self goes through portal lines of 1, process lines of 0 over 12, sets position of 1 line signals of earth line point lines of graph in point 0 of 24. Now that the system lines of travel that has a direct line link, how we process that through 12 lines of rotation graphs and set position to your rainbows of set design through the higher self, through its convergence of levels of operation. All through calculation. Okay? So I'm showing you so many different structures, what the higher self does all through travel. Okay, so getting in this position, so knowing exactly what you're doing through travel. Higher self again, work about test your attention region. Okay, lights of signal, ground centers, line core centers. We go through graphical screen locations, central lines of settings, and its operation sequence. Platitude box frames, center core centers, point graphs. Set calculation, modify line center, its position, its operation. Okay, so we can go through box frame, triangulations, the 3 centers of measure, and 2 centers of scale. Okay, go through that, set position, operation. All right, so modifying that line centers, line position, location of cycle. 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of high position. So we overlap the signals in 3 grounds of sequence. Now this is all done through the gravitation line centers and grounds, powers, and atmospheres. So it controls the gravity of its space. Avatar controls the space of its gravity. And everything of the same controls everything around the spectrum of circulation and rotations. Above, looking below. All right, through a GPS line center in location with GPS lock screen and direct line core centers into convergence setting. This sets up the probing of detections and high grounds in sequence to its temperature reading. Temperature reading lines to the higher self is always staying at 98,000 line. 3 centers of travel and 3 lines of indication setting of flux. 300 operation. Box frame trading lace and high centers travels in point lines of X marks the spot. Process lines of indication lines of flux over screen. Clocking zeros and platitudes in rotation system on spectacles that screen adaptations of travel. Sets coordinates, directing ground centers, 4 centers, influx over line rotation. Travels indicates lines of highways and travel calculation line ground centers. Changing 98 into 100% line. Set position 100,000 line center and screen. Set convergence lines of 2 million rotation lines of spins. The operation line signals, location setting, indicates lines of position, log into space. That's right. That's what the higher self does. Logs into space. As it's logging into space, the process of the indication setting knows exactly where the temperature reading is as it goes through all levels of its gravitational grounds in position of its operation system. That's right, guys, into its astral projections of its pyramids of its rotation. You know, this is underground, the actual pyramid itself. So everything is grounding setting to an operation sequence, the platitude's locational gravitational pull that has all communication setting that sets the operating system to its pixelation of its hologram that's processed and position lines of travel. Now, this is where it comes into the compulsories, and understand that through the parallels, understand that through all communication setting to a system. Center lines of graph, 4 centers of sequence, overlapping centers and travel communication to its setting through its operation set travel. Okay, very interesting when we come into that road graph screens. Platitude and location setting and all set travel communication. Okay. Okay, so as the higher self is gravity shift lines of anomalies, it's changing the properties of design. Remember, it's all in set position, how to use the formation setting through your data assets and set travel. Now, when you bring it out, you can start to see the structure of design line that you're setting up in your mapping systems all through pi. Okay, in all different angles. Because it's all levels of schematics, it's all levels of high set lines of travel through gravitational operation system that controls everything of the ground set sequence from 0 to 12 and 13 lines of measure. Okay, all through the higher self. Okay. All right. So I'm showing you different levels and 3 centers of indication system, how to go through the higher self. So this is your test for Friday. This is what your test is for Friday. And this is what your test is for next Friday. How to indicate that position. Creating the Merkaba. Okay. Creating the time reactor. And creating the flux line of its highway. Okay. 3 grounds of surface. Okay. All through travel. All through schematics, all through your primer. All right. Rotation spin lines has an operation sequence. The platitude locates in setting calculations. This high operates the Saturn cycle. Now, getting graph line core centers, its perimeter. Okay, so it's primer. Okay, so we get a centric graph and an operation graph. Now, it's amazing how you can platitude locates the setting through the higher self, so it indicates the setting of travel. Okay, inside and outside rotation. Okay, graph indications. We can change the lock screen to adaptation to the flux and set travel. Now, core line is a graph line communication setting converts the system. You set fonts lines, directing ground centers into pyramid activation lines of road screen location. Travel point lines of graph indicates lines of ground set lines of sequence. Change the core centers of time frame. Time locks, time edit, time pattern, time rotation, time travel, and set line communication. This is all done through the higher self at set position. Okay? So the higher self is creating a map now. As it's creating a map, it creates the energetic wave patterns that process indications through echo and sonar and set travel. As it's coming in that position location, it goes through wire signatures and processes all lines of what it's doing through its operation system as it goes in setting. Because if you convert the lines in one electrical line wire, indicate positions. Another primer sets overriding signal. Over signals, over graph, over communication, over essential line calculation. Okay, so that overrides in set lines of signals and lines of travel. Coordinates over flux in set lines of communications. All through setting, all through operation. Change formation time frame, change course centers, inline screen adaptations, a process of wire signatures and lines of grounds. So it sets position lines of all line centers, box frame triangulation over flights into fortitude location setting and box triangulation. Okay. There we go, and set calculation lines and all lines of formula through its equation. The box frames color the line centers, process in high position locations in system, all through equities and travels set calculation. Okay, outside signals and rotation graphs that indicates the grounds in the location system and travels in time frame. Okay, so it's really interesting when you look at all this, all through triangulation line condition setting to high position. So this helps you to identify how everything is already set up in your simulation. Graphs of indications all through flux, all through grounds, all through set position. Right? Your simulation's already there, done. So everything of structure you guys already have inside, and this process more levels of you, how you indicate that through memory of no memory. That puts you in position, location, settings, all through travels, into beacon lights of travel communication. Beacon light. Light, stage, and shadows in 2 directions. Use your imagination. Master it through that line centers. Comedic ground centers. There's the sun, right? What? You actually think the sun just comes out in the day? You project how you want to see the sun. You can see it in outer space. You can see it inside your room. You can add light fractions and division location of fractions over lines over proxy. There's so many things that you can do, right? You can even separate the moon. Okay, there's so many things you can do because it's all in the simulation anyway in travel. All through indication. Look at that. Boom, there's a beam. All right, here comes Pluto, right in signal. Okay, there's Pluto. Okay, it's not knowing the imagination, it's knowing how to use your own imagination. That brings things to life. And when you're bringing it to life, you're running a film strip. That's all it is. It's just a film strip, see, inside a film strip. Now, when you coordinate that, you set a longitude and latitude of streaming, what you want to do through time frame. Lots of signals, ground centers, and set position. All through 3 frames. That's it, boom. So you're looking at through a projector, through a viewfinder. And as you're going through that, you're going through 2 panels of 4 centers and set position with its operation. And what you get in that position lines and settings, you process your portals, okay, and the ground centers, okay, a truth and false narrative. So I got 4 centers of sequence, and I got 4 operation lines of space. There's the film strip of design. Booyah. Bring it out in signal and location lines of grounds. But look at the bandwidth you can work with in all line position locations once you understand how to actually project yourself a film of indication. Looking through a negative. Everybody knows what a negative, right? When you're getting your film developed, that's all it is. Now you have to understand how to get in cross-examination to a red room. Now, a red room processes everything through your photo ops. Now this comes into Lazella because she's a professional, and that lines of rotation lines, how she comes in that position. There's 2 convergence lines of filters, okay? There's an offline LED, and there's an inline sequence of red. Okay, infant red, as it goes black. The process line indication. Turn on the lights, you put the photos on a string. Now that indicates all lines of flux, how many times you're going through camera op screens of filter line divisional case to its cartridge. That's right, guys. Each line has a 1 signal and rotates lines of grounds. Now that correlates communication lines of LC1 or process of LC2. That communicates to ground lines of sequence applied to locations how fast you're going through your film strip of design that you're projecting your system and your images that changes everything at time, center, location, your foundation grounds. In that position, to all that information setting. Is it a coincidence that 13 line operation lines go to 14 lines of 7? No. Communicate to the higher self and set lines of its operation that process everything through its astral projections from 0 to 12 and 13 lines of measure of scale of communications, all through film strip of design. All right? Look how powerful it is. All through film, right there, running the system. And that's what you're seeing right there in set position. Now, seeing that through an operation setting, you can bring yourself in how you want to bring yourself because you don't exist. When you exist, you bring things in through energy, vibration, frequency, harmonics, and then you indicate that. If you want to get into more higher level setting, then you bring the formula, then you bring the equation, then you bring the structure, then you bring in the primer. Now you got a drawing that you're looking at and in position location. Now you see it through indication how you want to see it through pixelation or hologram. But you're processing that as you bring that in. Okay? All right, so and that comes in position. Going through observation right now. Seeing everything through observation. Me, seeing the observation, what I'm doing. Right? Okay, I disappear and I go somewhere else. All right? Because you're constantly moving. You creating new structure, running new programs, running new systems, running new ops, running new screens, running new data operating systems. See? Not there, I'm gone. So modify that, running that program in the location setting, gets in that position lines of balance, knowing exactly what's going on. As all you're looking at is a film strip of design that you're doing, that you're looking at, that you're projecting in your minds. It's constantly going and moving, 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 moving. The internal and external force is constantly moving. And if you're not moving your operation, the operation is moving you. Okay, that's all it is, just a film strip. Okay, running the film strip of files. Okay, now I want you to understand that you're walking inside the projection that's created through the program, the higher self, right? So there's the higher self, right? And there's the higher self, again, going faster through its frame. And there's a higher self in the 3 frames that indicates the center operation of its settings. And there's a higher self again going through another film strip of design and set lines of travel. Isn't that wild? Because that's all your life is based on, is a projector, how you see it, through a viewfinder instead of operation. Okay? Look at that. All through the higher self. Okay? But this is you bringing all this in. You bringing it on. But you don't exist. You are the mass of everything. The mass is nothing, but mass is everything of its combination. You're bringing in the mass. And all this is actually the body itself that you have to understand. It's the body of mass that you're bringing in through time. It's very powerful, guys, when you come to that position. It's operation cycle. But look at that. Look at the bandwidth. Look what you're creating through a film strip. You don't see it until you see it, what you're doing. Right? As it's crossing examinations as you're going through a film strip every hour of your minutes in your frames of communication. Okay? Seeing yourself in a planetary system. Seeing yourself in a scanning operations system and travel. Seeing yourself in your solar system in set positions operations. All through calculation. Right? There it is. But that's all it is, the astral projection. So I think it's fascinating when we look at the bandwidth and we look at the longitude and the streaming, how it comes in all lines of all communication setting and travel, all through the higher self. And it travels all together, right, in one setting. All right, so that's your test next Friday. Keep you guys 7 days ahead of schedule. Okay, so let's get in position lines of film strips. 3 centers EQ over lines in CG and D frame. All right, so in that position lines indicates the lines your highways. Your primers are the center operation of you through body weight. Mass conception line connection setting a formula, directing ground center location, your longitude, latitude, your streamings. So let's say that's your body, and you want to extend your body. Okay, and you want to go through your pi of body. Okay, and you want to go override your signals of body. Okay, then you want to put graph screens. That's what your body is. Now it's a leaf, just a leaf. And as you bring it in, what are you seeing? Information setting that travels a recognition timeline. Okay, bring it out line centers, bring course centers, convergence setting line positions. Bring it out lines that calculate the setting. Color it in. There's the leaf. So your body is now turned into a leaf. Light, shades, and shadows. Nothing structured, just a hologram and stream. That's all it is. As you bring it in, you see the illumination in 3 grounds of sequence. You see the space, you see the protection, and you see the plasma. There's the leaf. All right? All right. Let's bring the central lines of void over sequence. So you can see a broader line and longitude ladder line. Okay? Broad communication lines. Let's go in upline signals and travel communications. See the leaf coming in its realization setting to its projection. Now it's starting to look like a leaf, right? But you can see it stands out now. It's got coloration. But if you look really, really close, this is what everything looks like. Okay, start off line, so it's just going to black. So it is your highline signals. Okay, it's that, because that's bandwidth now. See, we're using longitude, latitude, making the leaf stand out through volume, mass, and velocity, and vacuum. All right, so then we go through red. Red is protection, which is the security that protects everything of its leaf itself, that modifies its own operation of its own system, all through travel, all through pixelation of its holographic system. Black and red, more volume, right? Then we go into blue, which is its shield. So the leaf is protecting itself from its own data operating system, from its own system of its own protection. And that's what it is. 3 grounds is setting this in. So when you bring a picture in, that's what you'll see, the simulation of resolution. Okay. You can see it in all platforms of set position. Now, if you want to make it bigger, you're adding pixelation, setting growth, spurts, 13 grounds of sequence. Let's add orange. So you're turning into a rainbow now, adding 12 signals into ground lines of operation, just through the higher self. All right, so that's where anything you come in volume after 5 line centers, you're coming in light, shades, and shadows now. Now, processing that through indication system helps you to identify your system and settings. So you can have 1 cent grounds, or you can add an override signal. So you can have light, shades, and shadows around the whole thing, or just around 1/3 setting of travel. Very complicated stuff, but a lot of fun. Okay, let's get into pink. Okay, so you can see the mass and volume of the leaf itself. Remember, everything is its own teleportation system that travels on its own of indications through its projection. Okay. Okay, coarse convergence. Let's get a business lines of dark frame. Let's add brown. So brown is the center coarse center of its gravity. That's its indication setting through its mapping system. And remember, everything inside the leaf has its own mapping system first. But you have to understand the mass and volume of the leaf itself. And when you start to recognize, you can start seeing its pixelation of itself, of its own configuration system, of space and time. Its own face recognition of different lines of leaf. All right, so once you get in that, you get another cross-examine. You process that position, location, line, condition setting, process that indication system, comes into the binary. Binaries go in. Remember, you have to go through the higher self. When the binaries go in, they shift lines of anomaly. So we go through space line. Okay, binaries go in the central setting and set position from the clouds, from the indication setting and calculation. Okay, so the binaries are going in, shifting lines anomaly. Now you see a graph. Now, when you see the graph, it's modifying its setting location so the body knows exactly where it's going to go. So the actual leaf is actually seeing the body. So what that means is the leaf, basically all vision comes from everything else that's attracting to you because you're not understanding attraction itself. You see the vision, but what you're seeing is the vision coming to you through the leaf. And it's all done through a map. So the body knows exactly where it's going to be as it picks up that leaf now. That's how it works in conscious being aware. So that's where it comes into set position to the void itself, right? Come to you through vision. So you're not picking up that leaf. You're seeing it through vision first. So the body knows where it's going to go through its mapping system through a binary that's already set up in lines of travel. So the body doesn't get confused how the leaf sets up the vision for the body to follow. Okay? That's how it works through a mapping system through its binary. So as it's shaping its anomalies and location system, it's creating a map inside the setting through the body to go through. Okay? So that's the body, okay, and that position. So there's the leaf and travel. Okay, so in that position, you get the image, you get the vision, right? It's like you want to go to the park and all of a sudden you're going to pick up a leaf. Right? So that's indicating setting because you brought it already in through attraction. So it's much easier to modify that through the conscious of being aware of these things, guys. That's what the binary is to higher self, to the avatar. And everything is all formations of attraction that you already identified through no memory. So it's much easier for you to process that through vision and cortex location setting to see the actual, how everything's set up through an actual projection of you through a slide projector that you set up through your viewfinder. It's much easier to identify that through location of your systems, all through travel. Okay, as we process through that, 3 signals comes into the graphs, like that. Okay, so that comes to you. It's a position. Okay. All right, so the leaf is coming to you. You're seeing it through image. You're processing that. You want to go to the park. And next thing you know, in that position, you're recognizing that sending line communications. You're seeing the leaf now in real time through the body. It's that position. And that's how it works, through astral projections of its connection. All through attraction, all through binary. Okay? Everything is its own operation system, guys. And that's what you have to start identifying. So I just want to show you the basic understanding when it comes to mass and volume through its projection of itself. Right? It's incredible force in that position. Okay? Because that's all it is. Nothing but wire signatures of its correlations. Just wires and signatures of the leaf. That's all it is. All right. The leaf itself is digital and computerized. It's at position. Okay. All right, so you can, again, cross-examine, and you can change the flux, you can change the grounds. The leaf is now changing its own color. It's already gone through you. You already picked up the leaf. Now you're putting back down the leaf. The leaf is now changing color. So it's morphing into different travel, a different direction. Yeah, that's right. Why, you think the leaf is still there? No, it morphs and it travels, it vortexes on its own system to other dimensions. But it knows exactly why it's there. It's that position, it's operation. So it travels somewhere else. Okay, and it shows that vision to somebody else. See, everything around you is giving you time frame, so you can understand how to adjust your body through an astral projection. So it's much easier to see through indications, so your body doesn't get confused as the leaf sets up the map. And when the leaf sets up the map, it sets up the vision for you to see it. And when you see it, it comes to you. And don't be surprised why your body is at the park picking up that leaf and that equation. It's not a coincidence. You're there because the leaf set up the map for you to see through its system of operation. Now, in that position to the higher self, you guys already know that through conversion because it processes what you're doing through travel now, which is precog in your system, seeing things that are already done. Now, processing that, all that line communication setting, you start to recognize everything that you brought in through attraction is coming to you now. You, through no memory. And it's much easier to identify that through the eyes. And it's much easier to identify that what's going on with the symbiote as it goes back to everything because it brought everything through attraction, but it also has to indicate it's its own operation system. One unity, one consciousness, one awareness. You come into that, and then you understand how to process yourself, how to use yourself through your own projection, and understand how to run your own operating sequence of patterns of face recognition. Okay? All through a leaf. All through travel. Okay? So, we're going to get in that position lines of settings, starting with this equation. Okay? And into the time reactor, through the higher self, and set positions graph, or road graph locations highway. Okay? That's your test for next Friday. Convergence settings along lines of travel, directing ground centers, lines of sequence, and platitude locates the system in travel. All right? See you in 5.